From ongoing wars to severe political instability, some countries remain too dangerous to visit in 2025. In this video, we'll count down the top 10 most dangerous countries you should avoid. Stay tuned to the end to learn about the common factors making these places so risky. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, share and comment. Let's start it. Number 10. Ukraine. Ukraine remains one of the most dangerous countries in 2025 due to the ongoing war with Russia, which began in February 2022. The conflict has led to widespread destruction across major cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kyiv. Civilian areas, including schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods, have been heavily bombarded, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties and millions of displaced people. Critical infrastructure, such as energy facilities and transportation networks, has been targeted, leading to frequent blackouts and humanitarian crises during harsh winters. The eastern regions, particularly Donetsk and Luhansk, remain active war zones with daily clashes and heavy artillery fire. Mines and unexploded ordnance pose significant threats even in areas where fighting has ceased. Additionally, the conflict has disrupted access to essential services such as healthcare, clean water, and food supplies, compounding the humanitarian situation. Despite international aid and diplomatic efforts, peace remains elusive, making Ukraine highly unstable and perilous for both residents and travelers. Number 9. Sudan. Sudan continues to face significant challenges in 2025 due to ongoing political instability and armed conflicts, especially in regions like Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile. After the ousting of former President Omar al-Bashir in 2019, Sudan entered a fragile transition period aimed at establishing a civilian-led government. However, the hopes for peace and stability were dashed in 2023 when fierce power struggles erupted between the Sudanese Armed Forces (SAF) and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces (RSF). This violent rivalry has resulted in thousands of deaths, widespread destruction, and mass displacement of civilians. Humanitarian conditions have worsened, with millions facing food insecurity and limited access to medical aid. Many international organizations have struggled to deliver assistance due to the dangerous environment. Civilians continue to suffer from violence, including targeted attacks, looting, and sexual violence in conflict zones. Major cities like Khartoum, once bustling with life, have become battlegrounds, forcing many residents to flee. Sudan's deteriorating security situation and lack of effective governance have made it extremely unsafe for both locals and travelers. Until a comprehensive peace agreement and stabilization measures are implemented, Sudan is likely to remain one of the most dangerous countries in the world. Number 8. Mali. Mali, a country in West Africa with rich cultural heritage and vast natural beauty, remains one of the most dangerous places in the world due to ongoing armed conflicts, terrorism, political instability, and a worsening humanitarian crisis. The conflict in Mali began in 2012 when Tuareg separatists in the north launched a rebellion demanding greater autonomy. Soon after, Islamist militant groups exploited the chaos, seeking to impose their radical interpretation of Islam. Despite several international interventions and peace agreements, the situation in Mali continues to deteriorate, especially in the central and northern regions, where violence remains widespread. One of the primary drivers of Mali's instability is the increasing presence of extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State (ISIS). These groups regularly carry out attacks on civilians, security forces, and even United Nations peacekeeping missions. The militants often target villages, markets, and public gatherings, resulting in thousands of civilian casualties and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. This persistent violence has destabilized daily life, forcing many communities to abandon their homes and livelihoods in search of safety. The lack of state presence in large swaths of the country allows militant groups to operate with impunity, further entrenching the conflict. In 2025, Mali remains at a crossroads, facing significant challenges on multiple fronts. While international attention and aid have prevented a total collapse, lasting peace and security remain elusive. The crisis in Mali highlights the complexity of modern conflicts, where ethnic tensions, extremist violence, weak governance, and humanitarian crises intersect. The future of the country largely depends on sustained international support, effective governance, and genuine efforts toward reconciliation among its diverse communities. Until then, Mali will remain a high-risk region where danger looms over daily life for millions of its people. Number 7. The Central African Republic. The Central African Republic (CAR) has endured decades of instability, making it one of the most dangerous countries in 2025. Since gaining independence from France in 1960, CAR has faced numerous military coups, rebellions, and political crises. The situation deteriorated further in 2013 when a predominantly Muslim rebel coalition, known as the Seleka, overthrew the government, sparking violent retaliation by Christian militias known as the Anti-Balaka. This conflict escalated into widespread sectarian violence, with both sides committing atrocities against civilians. Despite the deployment of international peacekeeping forces, the country remains in a state of perpetual conflict. Armed groups and violence. One of the primary reasons for CAR's instability is the proliferation of armed groups. Over a dozen militant factions control large swaths of the country, vying for power and control over its natural resources, such as diamonds, gold, and timber. These groups often engage in violent clashes, pillaging villages, and displacing thousands of people. Civilians are frequently caught in the crossfire, leading to mass displacement and a severe humanitarian crisis. More than a quarter of CAR's population has been displaced internally or has fled to neighboring countries. The presence of landmines and the threat of kidnappings make travel and aid delivery extremely perilous. Humanitarian challenges. CAR faces one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Over half of the population is in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, with millions lacking access to food, clean water, and healthcare. The ongoing conflict has disrupted agricultural production and crippled the economy, leading to widespread hunger. In addition, the healthcare system is almost non-functional in many parts of the country, with limited access to medical services for those affected by disease outbreaks and malnutrition. Despite efforts by international organizations to provide aid, the security risks and poor infrastructure hinder their work. In 2025, CAR continues to be a nation in turmoil, with little hope for a peaceful resolution in the near future. Number 6. Democracy Republic of the Congo. The Democratic Republic of the Congo (DRC) is one of Africa's largest and most resource-rich countries, but it remains plagued by political instability, corruption, and armed conflict. Since gaining independence from Belgium in 1960, the country has struggled with weak governance and a lack of effective democratic institutions. Decades of autocratic rule, civil wars, and foreign interference have left the country deeply divided and unstable. Although DRC has held elections since the early 2000s, these have often been marred by accusations of fraud, violence, and voter suppression, undermining trust in the democratic process. Challenges to democracy. Despite being a nominal democracy, the DRC faces numerous challenges that hinder its political development. Corruption is widespread, with political elites controlling the country's vast mineral wealth while the majority of the population lives in poverty. The lack of a strong, independent judiciary and free press further weakens democratic governance. Armed groups, especially in the eastern regions, continue to operate with impunity, often supported by external actors seeking to exploit the country's natural resources, such as cobalt and gold. These groups frequently attack villages, displace civilians, and disrupt electoral processes, making it difficult for the government to establish stability. Humanitarian and security crisis. The ongoing conflict in the DRC has resulted in one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. Millions of people have been displaced due to violence, and countless others suffer from hunger, disease, and a lack of basic services. The government's inability to control large parts of the country and protect its citizens further erodes public trust in the democratic system. International peacekeeping forces, such as the United Nations Organization's Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo (MONUSCO), have been deployed for years but have struggled to bring lasting peace. In 2025, DRC's fragile democracy continues to face significant threats from both internal and external forces, making the path to stability and prosperity a daunting challenge. Number 5. Somalia. Somalia, located in the Horn of Africa, has been plagued by conflict, political instability, and humanitarian crises for decades. The country descended into chaos following the collapse of its central government in 1991, leading to a prolonged civil war. Since then, various factions, including warlords, tribal militias, and extremist groups, have fought for control over different regions of the country. The absence of a stable government for many years allowed terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab to gain a foothold, posing a significant threat to both Somalia and neighboring countries. Despite international efforts to stabilize the country, Somalia remains one of the most dangerous nations in 2025. Terrorism and violence. Al-Shabaab, an extremist group with ties to Al-Qaeda, continues to carry out deadly attacks across Somalia. The group frequently targets government officials, military installations, and civilians, using car bombings and assassinations to spread fear. In addition to controlling rural areas, Al-Shabaab has conducted attacks in the capital, Mogadishu, and other major cities, making urban centers unsafe. The Somali National Army, supported by the African Union Mission in Somalia AMISOM and international allies, has made progress in recapturing territory, but the threat remains significant, and violence continues to disrupt daily life. Somalia faces a dire humanitarian situation, with millions of people in need of urgent assistance. Years of conflict, droughts, and food insecurity have left large portions of the population malnourished. The country is highly vulnerable to climate change, with recurring droughts and floods exacerbating the already fragile situation. In 2025, nearly 3 million people remain internally displaced, living in camps with limited access to clean water, healthcare, and education. Humanitarian organizations are working to provide aid, but ongoing violence and poor infrastructure complicate their efforts. Despite some political progress in recent years, the road to lasting peace in Somalia remains uncertain. Number 4. South Sudan. South Sudan, the world's youngest country, has been mired in conflict since its independence from Sudan in 2011. Although the secession was initially seen as a hopeful new beginning, tensions between ethnic groups and political factions quickly led to a devastating civil war in 2013. The conflict, primarily between forces loyal to President Salva Kiir and those aligned with his former vice president, Riek Machar, has resulted in tens of thousands of deaths and the displacement of over 4 million people, both internally and across borders. Despite multiple peace agreements, including the 2018 revitalized peace accord, violence continues, especially in rural areas. Ongoing violence and insecurity. Although the intensity of the civil war has reduced in recent years, sporadic violence remains a significant threat, particularly in regions with intercommunal tensions. Armed groups continue to operate, and clashes over resources, such as land, cattle, and water, exacerbate local conflicts. The country's security situation is further worsened by the proliferation of small arms, which fuels violence among communities. Humanitarian organizations operating in South Sudan often face significant risks, including ambushes and kidnappings, which complicate efforts to deliver aid to those in need. Humanitarian and economic challenges. South Sudan is also grappling with a severe humanitarian crisis. Over 2/3 of the population, about 9.4 million people, are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, facing acute food insecurity, malnutrition, and lack of access to basic healthcare. Flooding, which has become more frequent due to climate change, has displaced thousands and destroyed crops, further worsening the food crisis. Economically, the country relies heavily on oil exports, but years of conflict have disrupted production and deterred foreign investment. Corruption and mismanagement have also hindered the government's ability to rebuild and provide essential services to its people. Despite some progress toward peace, South Sudan remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world in 2025. The ongoing violence, coupled with a dire humanitarian situation and fragile political stability, poses significant risks for civilians and international workers. Without sustained international support and genuine political will from its leaders, achieving long-term peace and development in South Sudan will remain a daunting challenge. Number 3. Syria. Syria remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world in 2025, continuing to suffer from the devastating effects of a civil war that began in 2011. Although large-scale military operations have decreased in recent years, the country is still grappling with violence, instability, and a severe humanitarian crisis. Various armed groups, including remnants of ISIS, continue to pose significant threats, particularly in the northeastern and northwestern regions. Airstrikes, sporadic clashes, and bombings are frequent, creating a highly insecure environment for civilians. The humanitarian situation in Syria is dire. Over 6.8 million people are internally displaced, and another 5.5 million have sought refuge in neighboring countries. Access to basic services, such as healthcare, clean water, and education, remains extremely limited in many areas. Food insecurity affects a significant portion of the population due to the destruction of infrastructure and agricultural lands during the conflict. Additionally, economic sanctions and the collapse of the Syrian economy have led to hyperinflation, making it difficult for people to afford essential goods. Efforts toward a political resolution have been ongoing, but progress has been slow and fraught with obstacles. Various international actors, including Russia, Turkey, and Iran, continue to exert influence in Syria, complicating peace negotiations. The country remains divided, with the government controlling most of the territory, while opposition forces and Kurdish groups hold significant areas in the north and northeast. Despite calls for peace, the complex geopolitical interests of regional and global powers make lasting stability difficult to achieve. For the people of Syria, the road to recovery remains long and uncertain. Number 2. Yemen. Yemen, located on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, has been embroiled in a brutal civil war since 2014. The conflict began when the Houthi rebel movement, backed by Iran, seized control of the capital, Sana'a, and forced the internationally recognized government to flee. This triggered a military intervention by a coalition led by Saudi Arabia, which aimed to restore the Yemeni government. Over the years, the conflict has evolved into a complex proxy war involving regional and international powers, resulting in immense suffering for the Yemeni population. Humanitarian catastrophe. The war in Yemen has created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Over 80% of the population, roughly 24 million people, require humanitarian assistance, with millions on the brink of famine. Blockades, airstrikes, and ground fighting have devastated the country's infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and water systems. Cholera outbreaks have been rampant, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Aid agencies face significant challenges in delivering life-saving supplies due to ongoing fighting, blockades, and the targeting of aid workers. Civilian suffering and regional tensions. Civilians in Yemen continue to suffer the most from the prolonged conflict. Indiscriminate bombings, artillery shelling, and drone strikes have led to the deaths of thousands of civilians, including women and children. The use of landmines by various factions has also contributed to the high civilian casualty rate. The conflict has displaced over 4 million people, forcing them into overcrowded camps with limited access to basic necessities. Meanwhile, regional tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia have kept Yemen in a perpetual state of unrest, making diplomatic efforts toward peace incredibly difficult. Number 1. Afghanistan. Afghanistan remains the most dangerous country in the world in 2025 due to a combination of political instability, violence, and economic hardship. Following the Taliban's return to power in August 2021, the country has experienced significant changes in governance, security, and human rights conditions. Despite initial promises of moderation, the Taliban has imposed strict Islamic laws, restricting the rights of women and minorities, and fostering an atmosphere of fear and repression. The security situation in Afghanistan is highly volatile. While the Taliban claims to have restored peace after decades of war, insurgent groups such as ISIS-K Islamic State Khorasan province continue to carry out deadly attacks. These groups target civilians, government officials, and foreigners, making it extremely dangerous for anyone traveling or working in the country. Bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings remain frequent, particularly in urban centers like Kabul, Kandahar, and Jalalabad. Humanitarian crisis. Afghanistan is facing a severe humanitarian crisis. Over 28 million people, about two-thirds of the population, are in need of urgent assistance due to food insecurity, lack of healthcare, and economic collapse. The country's economy has deteriorated rapidly following the withdrawal of international aid and sanctions imposed on the Taliban regime. Many families have been pushed into extreme poverty, with reports of people selling personal belongings, livestock, and even their children to survive. Future prospects. The future of Afghanistan remains uncertain. While the Taliban continues to consolidate power, the presence of insurgent groups, economic collapse, and growing public dissatisfaction pose significant challenges to their rule. Efforts by international organizations to provide humanitarian aid continue, but without political stability and security, long-term recovery remains unlikely. While travel can be exciting, safety should always come first. Many of these countries are in dire need of peace and humanitarian assistance. Let's hope for a safer future for those living in conflict zones. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stay safe out there.